The Swedish couple, Olof and Anja Andersson, vanished from the unforgiving slopes of Mount Everest in May 2012. For 9 long years, their case was a frozen mystery, a ghost story whispered among climbers in the thin, cold air of the Himalayas. Their fate remained sealed in ice and silence until a British researcher, analyzing old expedition photographs, made a shocking discovery that would finally reveal the chilling and terrible truth. What he found in the pixels of a forgotten image was not just a clue, but the key to unlocking a conspiracy of silence, ambition, and murder in the highest place on Earth. The story of what really happened to Olof and Anja was far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. A dark secret that the mountain had kept for nearly a decade, and the revelation would change everything. Olof and Anja Andersson were not born adventurers, but they had found adventure in each other. They lived a quiet, comfortable life in a suburb of Gothenburg, Sweden. Olof was a meticulous civil engineer, a man who saw the world in terms of structure, stress, and support. Anja was a pediatric nurse, a woman whose life was defined by empathy, patience, and a deep well of compassion. They were opposites who had found a perfect complementary balance. They had met 15 years earlier, not in a cafe or through friends, but roped together on a climbing course on the granite cliffs of Bohuslän. For Olof, climbing was about physics and problem solving. For Anja, it was about trust and pushing past perceived limits. Together, it was their shared language. Their modest home was filled not with expensive art, but with framed photographs of them on summits across Europe: the Matterhorn, Mont Blanc, Elbrus. Each picture was a testament to their partnership. Their greatest creation, however, was their daughter, Freya, who was only 5 years old in 2012. She was the center of their universe, a bright, bubbly child with her mother's wide eyes and her father's thoughtful smile. The decision to climb Everest was not made lightly. It was the culmination of a decade of dreaming, planning, and relentless training. It was their ultimate goal, the final iconic peak in their personal collection. They saw it as the greatest expression of their shared philosophy, that with careful planning, mutual trust, and unwavering support, anything was possible. They took out loans, saved every krona, and spent years physically and mentally preparing. To their concerned families, they explained it with Olof's characteristic logic and Anja's soothing reassurance. They had hired the most reputable Sherpa team. They had the best equipment. They would use supplemental oxygen and follow a conservative acclimatization schedule. They made a solemn promise to Freya, sealing it with a hug that lingered in her memory for years. They promised they would plant a tiny Swedish flag on the summit for her, and then they would come home, safe. The climb was not about conquering the mountain. It was about achieving something profound together before settling back into the beautiful rhythm of their family life. It was to be their last great adventure. What they left behind in Sweden was not just a daughter and a home, but a life rich with love, purpose, and future plans. It was a life waiting for their return, a life that made their disappearance not just a mystery, but a deep and shattering tragedy. They had everything to live for, which made their silence from the top of the world all the more deafening. Their final push for the summit began on the evening of May 18, 2012. The weather window was narrow, a brief pause in the jet stream's relentless assault on the upper mountain. Olof and Anja, along with their personal Sherpa, Pasang, left Camp 4 on the North Col, entering the so-called death zone above 8,000 meters. The air here is impossibly thin, holding only a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Every step is a monumental effort. The body is actively dying. Their progress was slow but steady, a chain of 3 small headlamps moving against an infinite canvas of black rock and blue ice. Olof, always the engineer, meticulously monitored their oxygen levels, while Anja set a calm, sustainable pace. They were a self-contained unit of perfect trust. They were not alone on the ridge that night. Several other teams were attempting the summit, including a highly publicized Russian expedition led by a climber named Viktor Orlov. Orlov was a man carved from a different stone. Where Olof and Anja were quiet and methodical, Orlov was aggressive and fiercely competitive. His team moved with a ruthless efficiency, overtaking other climbers with little regard for mountain etiquette. Earlier at base camp, Olof had noted Orlov's dismissive attitude. He climbs as if the mountain is an enemy to be defeated, Olaf had written in his journal. Not a wonder to be experienced. The comment was uncharacteristically judgmental for Olaf, a subtle crack in his usually stoic demeanor. It was a piece of foreshadowing no one would understand until it was too late. As they ascended the first step, a notorious rock barrier, Anya felt a flicker of unease. Olaf's team was close behind them, pushing them to move faster than their conservative plan dictated. A brief, tense exchange occurred over a fixed rope, with Olaf's lead Sherpa gesturing impatiently. Anya and Olaf let them pass, preferring to stick to their own rhythm. Hours later, nearing the summit, they made their final satellite phone call to Olaf's brother, Lars, back in Sweden. The connection was poor, a string of words broken by static. Olaf sounded exhausted but exhilarated. Almost there, sky is incredible. Anya is strong as a lion. He mentioned the cold was more severe than forecast, and that his right leg was starting to feel numb. A passing comment that Lars dismissed as a typical hardship of the climb. Anya's voice came through for a moment, full of life. "Tell Freya we love her. We will see you all soon." That was the last anyone ever heard from them. They continued their ascent into the pre-dawn light, two small figures against the vast, unforgiving curvature of the earth. They were just a few hundred vertical meters from their dream, unaware that they were climbing, not just towards the summit, but towards a fatal encounter that would erase them from the world. The first sign that something was wrong was silence. Olaf and Anya were scheduled for a radio check-in with base camp at 8 a.m. on May 19th, after summiting. The time came and went. The radio remained silent. At first, the base camp manager, a seasoned veteran named Tashi, wasn't overly concerned. Radios fail. Batteries die. Summit euphoria can make climbers forgetful. But when another check-in at 10 a.m. was also met with static, a knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. He hailed other teams descending from the summit. A Spanish climber reported seeing them just below the peak around dawn, moving slowly but looking strong. An Australian team said they saw them on the summit itself, embracing as the sun rose. They were the last to see them alive. The hours crawled by. By midday, with no word, the dread at base camp had bloomed into full-blown alarm. Descending climbers were questioned intensely. No one had seen them on the route down. It was as if they had reached the top of the world and simply stepped off it. Tashi made the difficult decision to mount a search. He dispatched two of his strongest Sherpas to ascend back up from Camp of Four to their tent, hoping to find them there, exhausted but safe. The Sherpas reached the small yellow tent perched precariously on the edge of the North Col that evening. What they found immediately set off alarm bells. The tent flap was zipped shut against the wind, but the interior was unnervingly still. Their sleeping bags were laid out, untouched. Their personal belongings were neatly organized, but two critical items were missing: Olaf and Anya. Stranger still were the items left behind. Two full oxygen bottles were inside the tent, along with one that was half full. No climber in their right mind would attempt a descent from that altitude without taking every available canister of oxygen. It made no sense. It was a breach of the most fundamental protocol of high-altitude survival. A frantic radio call conveyed the scene to base camp. Tent is empty. They are not here. Sleeping bags are cold. Oxygen is here. Something is very wrong. The words crackling through the radio sent a wave of panic through the camp. It wasn't just a case of climbers in trouble. It was a scene that defied logic. The initial confusion curdled into a horrifying realization. They hadn't just been delayed. They hadn't suffered an accident on the descent. They had vanished, leaving behind clues that only deepened the mystery. Clues that pointed not to a simple tragedy, but to something far more perplexing and sinister. The official search for Olaf and Anya Andersson began with a desperate urgency, a race against a clock that was already running out. At 8,000 meters, a person's survival time without shelter or oxygen is measured in hours, if not minutes. The Nepalese and Chinese authorities were notified, and a multinational search effort was hastily coordinated. High-altitude helicopters were mobilized from Kathmandu, but their effectiveness was severely limited. The air above Camp 4 was too thin for them to do much more than perform brief, sweeping flybys, their rotors struggling to find purchase in the wispy atmosphere. From the sky, The vast monochromatic landscape of rock and ice revealed nothing. The real search had to be conducted on the ground, a task that fell to the Sherpas, the true masters of the high Himalayas. Teams of 6, their faces wrapped against the brutal wind, began the perilous task of retracing Olaf and Anya's route. They scoured the treacherous northeast ridge, peering into bottomless crevasses and scanning the steep icy faces for any sign. A piece of clothing, a discarded pack, a patch of color that didn't belong. The conditions were atrocious. A storm front moved in, battering the mountain with 100-kilometer-per-hour winds and driving snow, reducing visibility to near zero. The search was paused for 2 days, a tormenting delay for the family waiting for news. Olaf's brother Lars had flown to Kathmandu, a man adrift in a sea of bureaucratic chaos and unfamiliar customs. He sat in tense meetings with ministry officials, his frustration mounting with every passing hour. He felt a suffocating sense of helplessness, a world away from the search, unable to do anything but wait. The search teams faced their own conflicts. They were risking their own lives, pushing the boundaries of human endurance. One Sherpa suffered severe frostbite and had to be evacuated. Another developed high-altitude cerebral edema and was lucky to be brought down alive. The mountain was actively resisting their efforts. The search methodology was meticulous. The teams focused on the most likely accident zones, the 3 steps, the sheer rock barriers on the final ridge. They lowered themselves on ropes into the upper sections of crevasses, their headlamps cutting feeble beams into the darkness. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a fall, no bodies. It was as if the couple had been plucked from the mountain by an invisible hand. The failure of the search was compounded by a critical misdirection. Victor Orloff's team, who had summited on the same day, were briefly questioned upon their return to base camp. They reported seeing the Swedish couple descending below the summit, looking tired but fine. They claimed to have lost sight of them as the weather began to turn. Their testimony, coming from a celebrated climber, was taken as fact. It shifted the focus of the search to lower sections of the mountain, a fatal miscalculation. After 10 grueling days, with resources dwindling and the weather window slamming shut for the season, the official search was called off. The authorities declared Olaf and Anya Andersson lost and presumed dead. For the world, it was another tragic statistic in the brutal history of Everest. For their family, it was an unbearable open wound. The search had failed not just because of the weather or the terrain, but because it was looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place, guided by a lie that had been deliberately planted to conceal a horrifying truth. As the years passed, the story of the vanished Swedish couple slowly transitioned from a current tragedy into a piece of grim mountain folklore. The case went cold, filed away in a dusty cabinet in Kathmandu, another unsolved mystery swallowed by the Himalayas. For the family back in Sweden, the coldness was not in a file, but in their daily lives. They were trapped in a state of agonizing limbo, a grief without the closure of a funeral. How do you mourn people who are simply gone? Lars Andersson dedicated his life to finding answers, spending his savings on private investigators and fruitless trips to Nepal. He became a shell of his former self, a man haunted by his brother's last words on the satellite phone. The most profound toll was on Freya. She grew up in a house where her parents were both a constant presence and a complete absence. She knew them only through photographs and stories, heroic figures frozen in time on a distant mountain. Her grandparents tried to give her a normal childhood, but there was always a shadow, a question that no one could answer. On Everest itself, the story of Olaf and Anya became a cautionary tale whispered at base camp. New climbers were told of the Swedish ghosts of the North Col, a reminder of the mountain's capricious power. Their last known position became an unofficial, grim landmark. Guides would point towards the summit ridge and say, "That's where the Anderssons disappeared. No one knows what happened." They became a part of the mountain's mythology, their bodies presumed to be entombed in the ice somewhere on its vast face, joining the ranks of other climbers who had become permanent fixtures. They were often referred to by the poetic, tragic moniker given to another lost climber decades before, Sleeping Beauties, forever preserved in their icy tomb. This legend, while romanticized by outsiders, was a source of constant pain for the family. It stripped Olaf and Anya of their identities, turning them from a loving engineer and a compassionate nurse into a ghost story. The hope that had flickered in the first few months after their disappearance had long since been extinguished, replaced by a deep, hollow ache of resignation. The world had moved on. The news cycle had churned through countless other stories. But for one family in Sweden, and for a handful of people who knew the truth, the silence from the mountain was a living, breathing entity, a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. The mystery of their vanishing was no longer an active investigation. It was a settled, tragic fact of history. For 9 years, that history remained frozen. Then, in the autumn of 2021, an unrelated event nearly 6,000 kilometers away in Bristol, England, became the catalyst that would thaw the cold case. The event was not a dramatic confession or a new discovery on the mountain itself. It was far quieter, happening on the glowing screen of a computer. David Hempelman was not a climber, but a forensic archivist, a digital historian obsessed with unsolved mysteries. His specialty was using modern technology to re-examine old evidence. He was working on a personal project, creating a high-resolution digital archive of Everest expeditions from the 21st century. He had spent months contacting climbers from around the world, asking for their raw, unedited digital photographs. Most were happy to contribute to his historical project. One of these contributors was a retired German climber named Klaus Richter, who had been on the north side of Everest in May 2012. He sent David a hard drive containing thousands of high-resolution images from his expedition. For weeks, David methodically sorted, tagged, and filed the photos. It was tedious work. He wasn't looking for anything in particular related to the Anderson case. He was simply building his archive. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was examining a series of telephoto shots Richter had taken of the summit ridge on the morning of May 19th. The images were incredibly clear, taken with a powerful lens in the crisp morning air. One photo, file number DSC8847.jpg, caught his attention. It showed the final pyramid of the summit. In the foreground, he could see the tiny figures of Klaus's own team, but in the background, near the feature known as the second step, he saw other climbers. He zoomed in, the pixels resolving into sharp detail. He counted 2 figures, wearing the distinctive yellow and black down suits that matched the gear list of Olof and Anja Andersson. This was consistent with the official timeline, but then he saw something else. He zoomed in further, pushing the resolution to its limit. Behind the 2 figures, partially obscured by a rock outcrop, were 2 more figures. 4 people, not 2, and they were clustered together, not moving in a line. It was a strange formation. He felt a jolt of adrenaline. He cross-referenced the photo's metadata. The timestamp was 7:48 a.m. This was well after Orlov's team claimed to have passed the Swedes and seen them descending. According to Orlov, the Andersons should have been much lower down the mountain by then. But there was more. David enhanced the color and contrast. One of the 2 additional figures was carrying a bright red backpack. He scoured the expedition logs from that season. The Andersons' equipment manifest listed only black and gray packs. Orlov's team, however, was sponsored by a brand famous for its signature crimson-red gear. The red backpack was a direct contradiction to Viktor Orlov's official statement. It was a small detail, a single object in a vast landscape, but it was enough. It was a crack in the foundation of the 9-year-old story. David leaned back, his heart pounding. For 9 years, everyone believed Olof and Anja had died alone. This photograph suggested they were not alone, and that the people they were with had lied about it. The cold case was, all of a sudden, searing hot. The discovery of the photograph transformed David Hempelman from a passive archivist into a relentless investigator. His first call was to the photographer, Klaus Richter, in Germany. Klaus, now in his late 70s, confirmed the photo's time and location. He remembered that morning vividly. He recalled seeing Viktor Orlov's team near the summit but couldn't remember the details. The photograph was the only impartial witness. David's next step was to build a complete picture of who was on that ridge at that exact time. He spent weeks buried in data, cross-referencing expedition permits, summit certificates, and online climbing forums from 2012. He created a detailed timeline, mapping the positions of every known climber on the North Ridge on May 19th. The evidence was irrefutable. The only other people in that precise location at that time belonged to Viktor Orlov's expedition. The official story was that Orlov's team had a smooth, flawless ascent and descent, but David found a crack. He discovered that one of the Sherpas on Orlov's team, a man named Tenzing, had quit the high-altitude climbing industry immediately after the 2012 season. He had never guided on an 8,000-meter peak again, instead returning to his home village in the Khumbu Valley to live a quiet life as a farmer. It was a highly unusual career move for a Sherpa who had just been part of a famous summit success. David knew he had to talk to him. With the help of a Nepalese journalist, he located Tenzing's village, a remote settlement nestled deep in the mountains. In November 2021, David flew to Kathmandu and then took a small plane to Lukla, beginning the long trek to Tenzing's home. He found the former Sherpa working in a potato field, his face weathered by sun and lined with a sorrow that went deeper than age. He was a man carrying an immense weight. At first, Tenzing was guarded and denied remembering anything specific about the Swedish climbers. But David didn't push. He simply showed him the photograph on his laptop. He pointed to the 4 figures, the red backpack, the date, the time. He didn't need to say anything. Tenzing stared at the image, his face crumbling. For 9 years, he had lived with the secret. The digital proof on the screen broke him. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he began to speak, the story pouring out of him in a torrent of guilt and grief. His confession was horrifying. He confirmed Olaf and Anya had reached the summit. On their descent, just below the second step, Olaf had stumbled. It was not a dramatic fall into a crevasse, but a simple, devastating misstep. He had broken his ankle. He couldn't walk. They were still alive, but they were in grave trouble. Anya, terrified but resolute, refused to leave her husband, trying desperately to help him. It was then that Orlov's team found them. Anya pleaded for their help, for a spare oxygen bottle, for assistance in getting Olaf down. Viktor Orlov, seeing the situation, made a cold, calculated decision. Helping them would jeopardize his own descent and ruin his flawless expedition narrative. Olaf and Anya were rivals from another team. In his pathologically competitive mind, they were an obstacle. More than that, he saw an opportunity. With them out of the picture, his team would be the undisputed stars of the season. He spoke to his team in Russian, a language the Swedes didn't understand. The order was given. Tenzing watched in horror as Orlov and his lead climber took Olaf and Anya's remaining oxygen bottles. They ignored Anya's desperate pleas. Then, to ensure there were no witnesses left on the mountain, they did the unthinkable. They pushed the helpless couple into a deep, narrow crevasse just off the main path, a fissure hidden from view. They were alive when they fell. Orlov then turned to his team, his face a mask of cold fury. He threatened them. He told them if they ever spoke of what happened, he would ruin their careers and ensure their families in Nepal suffered. He paid them a bonus, hush money disguised as a summit reward. Tenzing, young and terrified, had kept the secret, but it had eaten him alive. The revelation was complete. Olaf and Anya weren't lost to the mountain. They were victims of a murder, executed and covered up at 8,700 meters, all for the sake of ambition and a clean story. The aftermath of Tenzing's confession was swift and explosive. David Hempelman, accompanied by his Nepalese journalist colleague, took the recorded testimony directly to the authorities in Kathmandu. Tenzing, though terrified of the repercussions, agreed to sign a formal affidavit. He saw it as his only path to redemption. The case, once a cold file, was now an active international homicide investigation. Interpol was alerted. The Quiet Archivist from Bristol had uncovered one of the darkest secrets in modern mountaineering history. The primary antagonist of the story, Viktor Orlov, had spent the last 9 years burnishing his legend. He had become a minor celebrity, a sought-after motivational speaker who gave corporate keynotes about leadership, risk, and conquering personal mountains. He had written a best-selling book about his flawless 2012 Everest expedition. He was the living embodiment of heroic achievement. The confrontation came during a press conference in Geneva for the launch of his new charitable foundation. As he was taking questions from the media, a journalist tipped off by David's team asked him directly about Olaf and Anya Anderson and the discrepancies in his timeline. Orlov's polished facade cracked. He first appeared confused, then dismissive, calling the question absurd and insulting. But when the journalist followed up, mentioning a Sherpa's confession and photographic evidence, a flicker of pure panic flashed in his eyes. He abruptly ended the press conference and was rushed away by his staff. It was too late. The story was out. Within hours, news outlets around the world were running the headline: "Celebrated climber Viktor Orlov accused of murder on Everest." Orlov went into hiding, releasing a statement through his lawyers that vehemently denied the slanderous and delusional allegations. But the evidence was mounting. Tenzing's testimony was corroborated by financial records showing the unusually large bonus payments Orlov had made to his Sherpa team immediately after the expedition. The why behind his horrific actions became brutally clear. Orlov was not just ambitious, he was pathologically so. Leaked documents revealed he had been on the verge of bankruptcy before the 2012 climb. The expedition was funded by sponsors who had demanded a perfect, heroic narrative. Any hint of trouble, any costly rescue of a rival would have meant financial and reputational ruin. He hadn't just seen Olaf and Anya as an obstacle. He saw them as a direct threat to his entire existence. His decision on the mountain was not made in a moment of panic, but as a cold act of self-preservation. He chose his legacy over their lives. An international arrest warrant was issued for Viktor Orlov on 2 counts of murder. The other members of his climbing team were also investigated as accessories, their 9 years of silence now exposed as criminal complicity. The heroic story he had built for himself had crumbled, revealing the rotten foundation of greed and malice beneath. The focus of the story now shifted from the crime to the closure. With Tenzing's confession came a map. He knew the precise location of the crevasse where Olaf and Anya had been hidden. A special recovery expedition was organized by the Nepalese government, funded in part by a Swedish foundation established in the couple's name. Olaf's brother, Lars, insisted on being at base camp for the operation. He had spent 9 years searching for a ghost. Now he was waiting for his brother to come home. David Hempelman was also there, not as an investigator, but as a witness to the final chapter of the story he had unearthed. In the spring of 2022, nearly a decade to the day after their disappearance, a team of elite Sherpas, guided by a somber and cooperative Tenzing, made their way to the location. They rappelled into the deep blue ice of the crevasse, and there, perfectly preserved by the cold, they found them. Olaf and Anya were together, their bodies resting side by side. The recovery was a solemn and dignified affair. They were carefully brought back to the surface and flown down from the mountain. The identification was a formality, but for Lars, seeing his brother's face, peaceful in death, was a moment of profound and gut-wrenching finality. The war he had been fighting for 9 years was finally over. There was no victory, only a crushing sadness mixed with a sliver of relief. Back in Sweden, the news brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty for their family. For Freya, now a poised and resilient 15-year-old, the truth was horrifying, but it was the truth. She could finally lay to rest the fantastical stories she had invented as a child to explain her parents' absence. She could now grieve the real people they were and the real brutal way in which they were taken. A memorial service was held in their hometown. It was not a somber affair of unanswered questions, but a celebration of their lives, now fully understood. David Hempelman felt no sense of triumph. The resolution he had brought about was steeped in tragedy. He had solved the mystery, but he couldn't undo the crime. He had simply replaced a question mark with a period, a final heartbreaking stop to the story of 2 people who had climbed to the top of the world, only to meet the very worst of humanity. The case of Olaf and Anya Andersson sent a seismic shockwave through the international mountaineering community. It was more than a story of individual evil. It was a damning indictment of the commercialization and competitive frenzy that had come to define climbing on Mount Everest. The unwritten code of the mountains, the sacred duty to assist a climber in distress, had been grotesquely violated. The Orlov affair, as it became known, sparked a fierce and long overdue debate. Articles in climbing journals and mainstream media asked a difficult question. Had the pursuit of records, sponsorships, and summit selfies eroded the very soul of mountaineering? The legacy of the tragedy was not just discussion, but action. In response to the international outcry, the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism, in conjunction with climbing associations, introduced new regulations. The duty to assist was no longer just an ethical code. It became a legally binding clause in all climbing permits. Failure to render aid to a person in distress, without significant risk to oneself, could now result in a lifetime ban from the Himalayas and potential criminal charges. Expedition leaders were required to undergo new ethics training. David Hempelmann's work created its own legacy. The documentary he produced, titled The Summit Lie, laid out the entire investigation in stark detail. It won numerous awards and became required viewing for aspiring high-altitude climbers. It served as a powerful, chilling reminder that the greatest dangers on the world's highest peaks are not always storms and avalanches. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the mountain is the person climbing next to you. On a personal level, the legacy was about a promise. Olaf and Anja had promised their daughter they would come home. In the end, it was a promise they couldn't keep. But Lars Andersen, their brother and uncle, had made a silent promise to them that he would find the truth. The discovery in the ice was the fulfillment of that decade-long vow, an act of love and devotion that finally brought them peace. The story of Olaf and Anja Andersen is a chilling testament to how the pursuit of glory can lead to the darkest depths of human depravity. It reminds us that even at the top of the world, you cannot escape the capacity for evil that resides within the human heart. If you were moved by this story of obsession and justice, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable true crime mysteries. Tell us in the comments, do you believe the changes made to mountaineering regulations are enough to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again?